For those that attended the March 2015 webinar presented by IEPA, my presentation is pretty much just going to be a continuation of that presentation, but it's going to be from a consultant's perspective. We're the ones interacting with the agency, we're interacting with the client and trying to address the indoor inhalation exposure route in the most cost-effective way possible. So the outline of my presentation, we're going to talk about screening for the pathway, and then preparing and executing a work plan, interpretation of data, and then concluding with resources and references. So screening for the pathway, we've reviewed phase 1 reports in the past as consultants. If possible, if there are investigational reports, previous investigational reports, that provides more technical data. That's what we want to look at. When reviewing boring logs, there's a lot of important information provided in boring logs. All this site data will be used to incorporate and update your conceptual site model. You see those listed for the boring logs, some of the details that can be inferred or obtained from boring logs when reviewing those. One of the things I want to point out here is the fill at the unusual depths. Most likely that might be a man-made pathway or corridor, something you want to pay attention to. Because soil gas can migrate along those corridors. With the soil data, you want to evaluate if there's a source area present or if there's free product present with the CSAT concentrations. When reviewing the wells, if there are historic wells on the property, you want to confirm that the wells are screened at the proper depths. They intersect where potential LNAPL or DNAPL may be occurring. And if there is historic groundwater, you can compare those to table H or I in IEPA TACO part 742. Just want to make sure that those reporting limits from historic data do meet those remediation objectives listed in the tables. Also reviewing figures, you're going to want to review for potentially underground utilities, operational areas, direction of groundwater flow. Geological cross-sections are excellent sources of information for the conceptual site model. And if there are soil groundwater plume maps, those should be incorporated into your evaluation as well. For petroleum sites under the leaking underground storage tank program, you'll be mindful of the vertical separation distances, 5 feet for the dissolved phase in groundwater or 14 feet for free product in the subsurface. I provided a link right here that provides the flow chart that was provided in the March 2015 presentation. And also to note, there are no separation distances for non-petroleum VOCs listed in TACO part 742. With all this information, then you develop your conceptual site model. The graphic to the right here, this is from the ITRC 2007 document. This is a nice little checklist that they provide in a document. You can refer to it when you are developing your conceptual site model. It also, I think, is an excellent thing to bring with you if you're doing a site visit. Questions to ask the site representative when you're doing your site visit. And from the conceptual site model, then you'll identify your data gaps. And the reason I underline that here is because your conceptual site model might result in data gaps that don't require soil gas sampling. Maybe you just need to put in a couple of soil borings or even just one groundwater monitoring well. So with that said, we then continue with preparing a work plan. IEPA recommends a work plan be prepared for approval prior to performing the investigation. I think with that said, if timing is of an issue and you've prepared work plans before to the IEPA and they've been approved, well, then you might want to discuss that with the client, the need to submit a work plan for approval prior to performing the investigation. When speaking with the IEPA, they actually reviewed my presentation. They recommend that you perform a soil and groundwater investigation first before you develop soil gas investigation if necessary at all. Because from there you can screen out where your hot spots are and then also what your contaminants of concern are. And The next bullet is prior to preparing a work plan, perform a site visit. The footnotes in TACO stipulate that to be able to compare your site data to those objectives, you need to have slab-on grade concrete floors. If there's a basement, concrete walls with no subs. You're going to want to confirm that when you perform a site visit. Also, when you perform a site visit, you can also confirm where you think utilities exist. If you're not sure what those utilities exist, you can also coordinate a site visit with a private utility locator to identify where the utilities are and also what sites are or what locations inside a building are accessible to actually do your investigation. Sampling frequency, when speaking with the IEPA, it's determined by recognized environmental conditions. And in the work plan, provide rationale and location for each sampling point. And then the last bullet deals with delineation. And this is thinking in my head is if you have a site that's industrial commercial, it might be converted to residential, you're going to want to compare to residential objectives. Also, if you have an industrial commercial property located adjacent to residential properties, if you're sampling near those residential properties, you're going to want to compare to the residential remediation objectives, even though the site that you're on is used for industrial commercial. If off-site work is required, you're going to need to notify those off-site property owners or prepare an access agreement before you perform that work. You're going to need to call Diggers Hotline before any underground or subsurface work is performed, include a health and safety plan, and for sites that have an active soil vapor extraction system, that system needs to be shut off before the soil gas sampling is performed. With the actual sampling points, TACO in TACO Part 742 and in the fact sheets, they recommend a soil gas probe installed at a minimum of 3 feet below ground surface. The text in red shows the preferred sampling points by the IPA, the temporary direct push method. That's with the geoprobe unit with the photo at the top right. Advantages of this, it's fairly inexpensive compared to permanent, and it's a little bit quicker. In the US EPA guidance that was released last week, they cite a Cal EPA document stating that they recommend that you wait 2 hours after the geoprobe is installed for the subsurface to equilibrate before sampling. Alternatively, there are permanent soil gas probes. The advantage of that is it can be resampled. And there are also the sub-slab probes. In TACO, that's a tier 3. You can install those with the traditional permanent method, or there's the vapor pins. Those are quicker to install, they're flush to the ground, and they're quick to remove as well. With groundwater, IEPA does accept temporary groundwater monitoring well data. That's more cost effective than putting in the permanent groundwater monitoring well, but like the temporary direct push method, if you need to sample it more than once, probably going to want to put in a permanent groundwater monitoring well. And then at the bottom here, I list sump. If you do have a sump, when speaking with the IPA, they had suggested to collect a sample of water from the sump and then compare that to tables H or I in TACO Part 742. Analytical methods, for those that have reviewed the recent ITRC petroleum VI guidance that was released this past October, I believe, in 2014. There's an appendix listed in there that goes over all the different analytical methods. What I'll say here is that the TO15 SIM method achieves the lowest detection limits out of all those methods listed. And regarding the sample containers, the larger the sample container, the lower the detection limit. With Tedlar bags, there is a stipulation in the regs about the holding time being no more than 48 hours. The photo on the right is of a Suma canister. And when contacting labs, you're going to want to confirm the lab cost and the turnaround time. And also going to want to, if possible, ask the lab to deliver a sample acknowledgement form. This is important to verify that the pressure on the canister itself is still negative when they receive it, to verify that no leak occurred in between when the lab picked it up and when it was received in the lab itself. The regs also stipulate that the labs do have to be NELAP accredited. Demonstration of biodegradation, that's under Tier 3. If you're going to want to go through that exercise, it's recommended that the soil gas also be sampled for oxygen, carbon dioxide, and methane. By doing so, it's another line of evidence to prove that the vadose does support biodegradation. Pardon me.
It's not going down.
No.
There we go.
Okay. And then indoor air sampling, this is Tier 3. It's strongly discouraged by IEPA, but what I will say here is if it's necessary to perform an indoor air sampling event, conduct a survey prior to performing the event to identify potential indoor air sources. And other state guidances recommend that when doing indoor air sampling, you also perform sub-slab or subsurface soil gas sampling concurrent. That way you can compare the ratios of the contaminant concentrations in the subsurface to the indoor air. In case in point, if the concentration in the indoor air is greater than the concentration in the subsurface, well, that's likely because as a result of an indoor air source. I apologize for any Michigan fans in the house, but the next slide after this, we're talking about the execution of the work plan. I happen to be from Ohio, for those that know me. This lists some typical field issues that are encountered when actually doing the vapor intrusion sampling. I think one of the more important ones here I want to talk about is verifying the pressure in the canister. Those pressure gauges that come along with the Summa canisters, they get a lot of wear and tear. They're fairly fragile and sensitive. You're going to want to verify before you sample that the correct negative pressure is on that Summa canister. What we find that adds value, we bring out a pressure gauge out in the field that's calibrated annually, digital pressure gauge, and we just verify that pressure before we actually do the sampling. These are a couple photos. Photo on the left, that's coworker Brian Hennings. He's verifying the pressure on a Summa canister before sampling. Photo on the bottom right, that's purging of a soil gas probe before actually performing the sampling. Next comes the interpretation of the data. I realize this slide looks a little busy, but this is kind of like a flow chart we prepared at NRT. And it's kind of like a roadmap to interpret the results or the data that's collected. I'm going to break it up so it's a little bit more easier to digest. I think this first slide is a Tier 1, Tier 2 evaluation. I think the first question to ask here basically is, does your site meet the conditions or the footnotes set forth in Table H and Table I of TACO? Does it have concrete floors? If there's a basement, does it have the concrete walls? Are there no sumps present? If it meets those criteria, then you can proceed this way. If it doesn't meet the criteria, well, you can go ahead, you're going to have to go through a Tier 3 evaluation. If timing's of the issue and you know that you have a greater potential of vapor intrusion, you might consider just going straight to a building control technology. But traditionally, if the site meets all these criteria, then you can compare to Table H or I, depending if there's any contamination within 5 feet of the building slab. And these blue boxes here are when no further actions required. This is something that should be discussed with the client. As long as they don't mind having an institutional control, relying on the concrete building components, Table H or Table I is going to be the most practical and common way to proceed. If you don't want any if you don't seek any institutional controls, well, then you can compare to the J&E 1 and 2 indoor air objectives. Those are much lower than the Table H and Table I objectives. But if you are below those screening levels, then no institutional controls are necessary. Tables H and Table I, the lookup tables. Like I stated before, and the difference between Table H and Table I is there's going to be additional institutional control for Table I, which is less stringent, that ensures that there's no contamination within the advection zone. But if you do have exceedances of those lookup tables, there's always the exit ramp option of remediation, or there's the Tier 2 evaluation. The Tier 2 is the modified J&E, and for those that are familiar with the modified J&E, that's different than the US EPA J&E equation. So you perform the modified J&E equations to calculate site-specific soil gas, groundwater remediation objectives. If you don't exceed those objectives, then no further action should be warranted. There'll be an institutional control similar to the institutional controls for the Table H or Table I comparison. If there are exceedances, remediation is an option, or a Tier 3 evaluation. And here's the Tier 3 evaluation. You have the pathway exclusion, or you have the alternate modeling or sampling. With the pathway exclusion, there's the building control technology, and that results in institutional control not only to operate but also maintain it. There's another pathway exclusion where if no building is present, you can exclude the pathway, but then an institutional control then restricts the future construction in those contaminated areas that have been identified, and then another pathway exclusion with BTEX biodegradation. With the alternate modeling, this is where the other media come into play. This is the subslab sampling, the soil data, indoor air, or the actual sump sampling. And then the modeling alternatives. The US EPA online VI calculator, I believe that was recently updated for consistency based on the US EPA OSWR guidance that was released last week. And there is also a US EPA Johnson Edger model calculator as well that's available online. The Tier 2 indoor inhalation objectives are actually found on the IEPA website for those that were unaware. You don't have to calculate it yourself. That's a link right there. And then also, if you are going to try to achieve a site with no institutional controls, you're going to want to contact the lab before you do the sampling to confirm that they can reach those low concentrations for the indoor air objectives. And resources and references. IEPA is very helpful. US EPA, other state agencies, a few come to mind. There's regionally, there's Wisconsin has their guidance, and Michigan has their guidance, and then other states like Massachusetts, New Jersey, California, they're also, I think, have some useful information provided in their guidance as well. Websites you see listed here, LinkedIn, and webinars like this and conferences also are also excellent ways to be updated on vapor intrusion. References here, one of the things I want to cite here is the first presentation I have listed by the AIPG for those that are unfamiliar with Tier 2 calculations. I think this is an excellent presentation. It provides Tier 2 not only for the J&E, modified J&E model, but also for construction worker exposure. There's also the new guidance listed that was released last week by the US EPA. And then also the petroleum vapor VI guidance. They're the ones that, that's the guidance that I mentioned that has useful information not only on the analytical methods, but also the sampling methodologies in the appendices provided in that document. And that's about it. For those that are interested in copies of the presentation, send me an email directly, and I will be more than happy to send you copies of the presentation.